All right, so what I would like to do is I'd like to begin with a few more thoughts about the Industrial Revolution. So in my previous lecture, we had discussed the Industrial Revolution at some length. And I think in the concluding moments, I had done two things. One was to alert you to what I had described as the reaction of the Romantics to the Industrial Revolution. And then we had looked very briefly at the whole history of the Factory Acts. And why is it that the capitalist industrial elite, if I may put it this way, why they consented to these Factory Acts, right? So what I want to do then is offer you some concluding thoughts, some more reflections on the Industrial Revolution. So I'll be reiterating some of the things that I've mentioned to you before, and I'll be introducing a couple of new elements in this short discussion that we're going to have before we move on to the next segment. So as has been already pointed out to you, one of the ways in which we understand the Industrial Revolution is that it's basically effects a shift from a trade-based economy to a manufacturing-based economy. So the advent of factories. If we're going to have Factory Acts, the reason why they needed Factory Acts is because industrial production had now shifted to what are called factories. The nature of work changed, and again I have alerted you to this consideration before. Not simply the fact that there is specialization of labor. One of the things that Marx is going to talk about moving ahead in the 1840s, the early Marx's 1844 manuscripts, as they're called, and a work called The German Ideology from the following year. But moving on to his magnum opus, Capital, 3 volumes of that, where he discusses such things as surplus value, the labor theory of value, alienation of labor. But one of the things he discusses is the specialization of labor. That that the person who used to be able to take a product from the finish, from the beginning until the finishing point. Right? So let's say you're making a pot. So you begin with the clay and you take it all the way to the very end. But when you have specialization of labor, it's like going to an automobile manufacturing unit. Someone puts in the doors, the other person puts in the steering wheel, a third person is responsible for the air conditioning system, one person is responsible for the welding. No one has an organic relation to the product anymore, so to speak, right? And that in part, not entirely, this is not a detailed discussion here of Marx's theory, but that in part is what Marx meant by the alienation of labor. And as I pointed out to you, that the very idea of work actually becomes dominant, right? That we now devote our lives increasingly to something called work, and this is something that really begins with the Industrial Revolution. Thirdly, pointed out to you that some people sometimes view the Industrial Revolution and capitalism as synonymous. I have suggested to you that that's actually a mistaken view, because capitalism has an earlier history. But what you do find is a new form of capitalism, a more intensified form of capitalism than what you had before. Right? And that's where one begins to understand what is it that the Industrial Revolution was able to do, was to create this new intensified form of capitalism, with, of course, concomitant consequences for a number of other industries as well, including banking, finance, so forth and so on. Fourthly, a new system of global trading, which had, again, always existed, but then when we get to India, which we will in this lecture now, in just a few moments, we're going to see that the nature of this trade is going to shift. And recall the slides that I had shown you in my previous lecture, where it pointed out to you the whole argument about what's called the Great Divergence, that India and China used to be dominant players of the world economy, and then circa 1800 this begins to change, and then throughout the 19th century both India and China's share of the global economy really begins to diminish significantly, right? And of course, when we speak about new patterns of global trading, here I'm also speaking about colonialism. And this is the juncture at which to point out that colonialism will now henceforth be one of the dominant themes of the course, that even when we may be looking at other segments, colonialism is always lurking there in the background, right? Because this, of course, is one of the definitive features of the modern period. the whole acquisition of colonies by the European powers. And of course, there is an earlier history there too. If you look at the Americas, where Spain and Portugal, but now in the 18th century, we're speaking again about colonialism in a new form and in a much more intensified form as well. Fifthly, now we get into slightly different dimensions. That, if you look at Europe, so the Industrial Revolution comes to Britain first, and as I've already suggested, it's going to come to other parts of Europe later on. But what is common to all of the countries where the Industrial Revolution comes is the fact that these are Christian nations. And so there was some kind of feeling which was pervasive, I would argue, in the pre-modern period among some sectors of the Christian population, and that feeling was that the acquisition of wealth is something that is not really desirable, that this is almost sinful in a way. And I'm saying that one of the things that changes actually in the mid-18th century and moving forward with the coming of the Industrial Revolution is the fact that attitude towards wealth changed, that the accumulation of wealth was no longer as seen as sinful. And what you are going to, of course, witness at the same time is the decline of the church, right? Something which continues over the course of the 19th century. And this is in part what I mean by the point that I make after that, which is that the processes of secularization increased in society. So when we say that the processes of secularization increased, what I mean by that is a number of things. The first and foremost is the fact that religion is now going to have less of a force in public life, and various institutions are going to get secularized. But secularization also means the elevation of reason over faith, the elevation of reason over faith, right? That in a highly secularized or secularizing world, we turn more to ourselves, right? There is a certain kind of subjectivity which becomes important. You look less to the divine, right? So if, for example, you're a peasant and you see that there is a drought year after year, well, the pre-modern peasant might have said, well, that's the way of God. I don't really know what the ways of God are, so to speak. But when you have this process of secularization, then you begin to think differently about what might be the circumstances which actually lead to something called a drought. All right? So this is an important aspect of it. And what I'm trying to suggest here, of course, is that we cannot study the Industrial Revolution simply as an economic process, which is what used to be sort of the dominant reading of the Industrial Revolution for a long time. You also have the collapse of the moral economy. Now, let me dwell on that point for a couple of minutes. It's exceedingly important, and it's a contentious point. Right, so the idea of the moral economy was explored at great length by an English historian by the name of E.P. Thompson in a majestic book called The Making of the English Working Class. Right, it's a huge work. And he's basically looking at the history of the working class in Britain. Now, one of the things that he points out is that if you look at the history of Britain, for a very long period of time, and that would have been true of other countries as well, but here he's focused more on the English working class, that you had periods when there were food shortages. When you have food shortages, you also have food riots. All right? Now, his argument is that in the pre-modern period, and so when I say pre-modern here you might read that as pre-industrial revolution, before the coming of the Industrial Revolution, when social relations began to change in that society. In that period before the advent of the Industrial Revolution, there was a kind of tacit understanding in English society that when you have shortages of food, when you have famine, for example, hunger, that there are limits to a person's greed. But because you know what typically happens when you have famine or when you have a shortage of food, that some people will start to hoard food. And there's some people will take advantage of the situation, and you're going to have a massive hike in prices. All right? And one of the arguments that has been made by an economist by the name of Amartya Sen, who's now at Harvard, used to be at Oxford before, an Indian economist who won the Nobel Prize for his work on famines, among other things, is that he argued that in a democracy, you will never have a famine. In other words, a famine is not something that is a natural occurrence. It is a man-made event. Right? And when we get to China in the 20th century, and the Soviet Union in the 20th century, in both of these places you witness massive famines. All right? In relatively recent times, we're going to see that this is very much the case. Now, you'll see what the argument here is. Okay? That famines, he is arguing, are man-made. That is to say that there are people who no longer have access to food. They don't have entitlements, he calls them. Now, if you transpose this to the 18th century, what E.P. Thompson is saying is that, look, we have this view that the greed of man knows no check, knows no bounds. And he says that actually that's not really the case. Because in the pre-industrial revolution period, it's not as though people were saints. There were some people who hoarded and some people who took advantage, but there was a check that you placed upon yourself about the limits of your greed, so to speak. This is what he calls the moral economy. There was an understanding that if there's a person or a group of people who are dying, in many of these situations, someone will come forward and say, let me lift you up on your feet, so to speak. This is the moral economy. And he says that with the coming of the Industrial Revolution, you have the collapse of the moral economy. That is, that certain kinds of social relations are going to get altered, and altered for the worse. And this is, of course, in a sense, the meaning of modern capitalism, the idea that there is absolutely no restraint, no limit on a person's greed or ambition. And this is what we have seen, of course, with modern day capitalists, that you could have $5 billion. Well, you don't go into retirement when you have $5 billion, because then you want to add another $5 billion to it. And then when you have 10, you want to add another 10 to it. Right? And this is, of course, the nature of capitalism too, that productivity gains will lead to more productivity gains. But we don't need to have an elaborate view of capitalism to understand the point he's making here, because what he's suggesting is that when we think of the Industrial Revolution, we cannot simply think only of technological change now. Right? What we have to think about is a change in values, a change in the moral dispensation of humankind. This is a concomitant part of the Industrial Revolution. Something has altered in a fundamental sense of the term. This is no longer an incremental change. That's the argument, all right? And of course, there was a rise of the middle class. With the coming of the Industrial Revolution, gradually there's going to be a rise of the middle class, and then we're going to see as we move along later on what was the nature of the middle class that arose, right? And what is, in fact, the defining feature of the middle class. This is not something that is going to become clear at this point in time, but it's going to gradually become more clear as we begin to see the evolution of the middle class itself. And then there is, of course, this was my concluding thoughts from the last lecture, there's a physical transformation of the landscape, right? The idealized English landscape is going to change. You're going to get these chimneys, you're going to get warehouses, you're going to get factories, soot, pollution, all of that. And this is what's, of course, going to give rise to the reaction in part. The English Romantics were responding to a number of things, but they were responding to this as well, right? And then the decline of the notion of the commons, right, which is related to some of these economic consequences of the clearing of the land, enclosures acts, right? So this idea that there are things that belong to everyone in common, the notion of the commons. There's pasture land, and if you've read the two chapters from Jawaharlal Nehru's Glimpses of World History on Ireland, he talks a little bit about the transformation of Ireland itself, right? Through some of these enclosures acts, the removal of the pastures, so forth and so on. And the Industrial Revolution sharpens the divide between the positivists and the romantics, so this is related obviously to the whole question of the English the reaction of the English Romantics, those who in fact actually take the view, when I say the positivist, I'm talking about those who basically are arguing for what you might call a realpolitik view of the Industrial Revolution. They're saying that, look, I mean, yeah, you know, mankind is going to be lifted from poverty. There's going to be access to all kinds of goods. There's going to be a greater number of people who are going to have access to these goods. And things like the Factory Acts, for example, show that some of that spirit of goodwill still remains, notwithstanding the fact that capitalism is self-aggrandizing, brutal, so forth and so on. Right? So these are what you might describe as a positivist. Of course, there are other meanings to the word too, namely the idea that the world is knowable. The world is knowable, and then, of course, one of the things we're going to begin to see, beginning in the late 18th century, 19th century, is the beginning of what is today called social sciences. Right? Because what are the social scientists trying to do? They're trying to capture the reality out there. Right? And when we have that field trip to the Fowler Museum, at that point I'm going to talk to you about the emergence of the modern university. You're all seated in a university. What is the nature of this institution called the university? When did it emerge? When did the disciplines get carved out separately? When did economics, geography, anthropology, sociology all become different disciplines? Right? And what is the special provenance of each discipline? So forth and so on. Right? So the positivists are looking at the world in this way. Right? And the romantics are, of course, looking at the world of the imagination. They're looking at certain kinds of values of and sentiments and feelings, and they're trying to understand how the Industrial Revolution is really altering the human sensibility. All right? And finally, my closing thought on this complicated section, because I've tried to complicate the narrative for you by suggesting that it's not simply a narrative about economic change and technological change and so forth and so on, right? But this is the question. There are countries in the world today that are not fully industrialized. I mean, you're already living in a post-industrial society today over here. But there are countries that still don't have what we might call all the rudiments of the Industrial Revolution even in place, in some sense of the term. And you can have one country which could actually be in 5 different phases at the same time. You know, I mean, so, you know, if you think of it this way, I mean, you go to a remote village in India, let's say, a remote village in the state of Rajasthan, or let's say northern Bihar. And in that village, young women may be using social media, right? So they may be texting, they may be using Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, whatever the case might be, right? They may be doing all of that. And at the same time, their parents may have completely forbidden them to have relations with anyone outside that village. Their movements might be strictly monitored, right? So what do you have here? What you have here is a situation where some of the technology that is being deployed is exactly the same technology that is being deployed right now in 2019 in the United States. And then some of the thoughts that these people are having don't seem to have any relation to 2019 at all. Right? They may be institutions of patriarchy, and this is, by the way, not particular to India. I mean, I'm just giving you an example, you know, right, of the kinds of stories that crop up in Indian newspapers every now and then. So the question we are asking is it sufficient to have new forms of technology and advanced machinery, or do we need corresponding changes in social structures, in the polity, and in what might be called the mindset of people? Right? To effectively create an industrial revolution, so to speak, or to now create a cyberspace revolution, would we need to have just not simply those technological changes, but would we have to change the social structures of that society? And of course, in that sense, you could say that every revolution, even in this country, is incomplete in some sense of the term. That we don't have. So let me put it to you this way, that, you know, if you look at the modern period, if you look at society today, I mean, you could say that the technological changes have outstripped entirely our moral values, so to speak. That is that we haven't in our thinking necessarily been able to comprehend how we as humans have to think about social relations, because the changes there have been much more incremental than the changes in technology, which have been really at an extraordinarily accelerated rate. Right? So there are these interesting questions that emerge from the Industrial Revolution itself, which in fact lead down to the present day. All right. Now, the segment that we are going to move into for the rest of today and the lecture on Friday should really be viewed as one collective segment. The ambition is very great, because we have to cover a huge amount of material here. And when I say a huge amount of material, I don't mean really in terms of reading or anything of that kind, but kind of subjects that we're really thinking about, which I think we can think of as one unit. And that one unit is, we really have to look at the idea of the nation state, colonialism, and of course what will ensue later on in the wake of colonialism is nationalism. What's the relationship of nations to nationalism? That's something that we will take up again as well, right? Because we're going to find that there are going to be intensified forms of anti-colonialism as we move on into the late 19th century, and then of course in the 20th century. The second half of the 20th century is in fact characterized principally by what we would call decolonization, by anti-colonial movements in large parts of Asia and Africa. But of course in some cases these movements go back to, as in the case of India, certainly go back to the 19th century, right? But the units are such things as nation. What is a nation? What is a nation state? How is a nation and a nation state different? What is the nature of colonialism, right? And of course, the acquisition of colonies is then going to lead to various kinds of consequences. The principal case study for us is India under British rule, first from 1757 to 1857. And I want to just warn you right now that you're going to see some slides there which you don't have to comprehend all that material. You're not going to be tested on it. It's simply to give you some sense of how we might be able to understand the history of colonialism by looking at one particular case study, which is a rather complicated case study. So what you're going to be getting in 10 minutes there is what I would do in a whole quarter when I teach the history of British India. I teach a course on the history of British India in upper division lecture class, and all of that is going to be distilled in about 15 minutes, right? Just so that you kind of understand what is the nature of European incursions into the rest of the world, in particularly looking at India, and trying to understand whether we should take a view of colonialism which simply looks at what Europe was doing outside Europe, or whether there were internal forms of colonialism. Right? Because I want to submit to you, as a general proposition, this is a very wide proposition, I want you to think about it, to ruminate on this, that we cannot really fully comprehend the idea of colonialism, European colonialism in Asia or Africa or Central America, for example, until we understand that Europe first colonized some of its own people. The English colonized the Irish. They colonized their working class. They colonized their women before they went and colonized or brutalized the Indians or the Africans. And exactly the same argument could be made for any other colonial power, whether it's the French or the Belgians or the Dutch. All right? And that's one reason why you were assigned those two chapters from Nehru's Glimpses of World History. Recall what that book is. It's a collection of letters written by Jawaharlal Nehru, who is subsequently going to become the Prime Minister of India, to his daughter Indira. She would have been just a tad bit younger than most of you. I think she was about 15 or 16 when he started writing those letters to her. You know, all right? A sweeping account of the world. And of course, we are going to be entertaining some general propositions about colonialism. In particular, I want to look at one aspect of colonialism, which is the politics of knowledge. Right? And I will explain that to you as we come to that. And we're going to look at one document in particular within that, which is Macaulay's Minute on Indian Education. And when we're looking at these general considerations about colonialism, we want to look at, for example, what might have been some of the differences between Africa and India. And again, this will be a subject that we will be revisiting later on as well. All right? And moving down to the last portions of the slide, we're going to sort of briefly entertain some considerations about revolutions in Latin America, what's happening in that part of the world, the revolutions in Europe in 1848, concluding with the rebellion of 1857 and 58 in India, which is going to usher in very significant changes, and what Marx thought about India. He wrote widely, by the way, on India. Of course, he never visited India. Most of the people that we're looking at, European writers on India at this point in time, they never visited India. Some did, but most of them didn't. And what he wrote on India was what he wrote while he was seated in the British Library, right? Looking at, studying the telegrams and documents that were being published at that period. All right, here, let's just first look at this very briefly. So this is, if you're looking at Europe's colonies in 1660, okay, and you see, there's a color coding there. So this is the United Kingdom, and then you see, of course, Russia over here. You can see the green. So if you look at Africa, you see over here the little stretches of green here. These were already European colonies, well, Portuguese colonies. And of course, in the Americas, most of Asia, you notice there are no colonies at this point in time. But just look at 1754, all right? And you see, of course, you see a significant change there as well. Not overwhelmingly significant, but if you look at India here, now you see in comparison to the last slide, you can see that there's a lot more color here, and you can see various different colors because of what it's suggesting, and you're going to see a more detailed slide in just a moment, that there were a number of European powers who had moved into India, although the conquest of India had not taken place at this point in time. And we know that in Latin America, it was mainly the Spanish, and then of course in Brazil, of course, you have the Portuguese, and you have little pockets here. This is Suriname, what is now Suriname, right? So the Dutch Guinea over there. And then if you look at 1822, now you see that the entire coast of India is shown as being under, it's in red, so it's being shown as being under British rule. And of course, you have to remember that the white colonies were dominions, right? So Australia and Canada didn't quite occupy the same, and New Zealand didn't quite occupy the same place as India did, because they obviously had much greater status since they were predominantly white dominions and settled by white people. And of course, you had a substantial genocide in countries such as Australia of the Aboriginal population. If you look at Africa, again, you can see coastal. Once again, the reason why, of course, coastal colonization is because people are coming in by ship at this point in time. And then 1885, Europe's colonies over there. So now you see India is entirely under British rule. Australia, of course, is a white dominion. The middle portion is Central Australia, which anyone's ever been there, you know that it's all desert. And again, some portions here, but you notice that Latin America is now free of colonies in the formal sense of the term. In the formal sense of the term, the United States continued to have enormous influence in the Americas, particularly in Central America, but even in South America, and this would continue to increase over the years. Here you see 1898. So the shift is really significant because now you have what was called the Berlin Conference, where Africa is going to be now really carved up, and virtually all of Africa now has come under colonial rule. All right. So here you see European settlements in India. It's a long history why the Europeans were interested. There were lots of reasons. One of the reasons they were interested in was to obviously, there are these fabled stories. In fact, actually Hegel talks about it in his philosophy of history. the fabled wealth of the Orient, so on and so forth. And again, we're not interested in the question of whether these fables had merit or not. That's not the point here. But there were legendary accounts, obviously, that had been circulating in Europe for a long period of time. The other interest, of course, has to do with increasing trade. You have to always find new markets. India was a place that had a flourishing textile industry. And recall once again those figures, that if you're looking at 1750, India, China, major players, right, in the world economy. So there's obviously interest in coming to India for a number of reasons, but there are a number of European powers. So you can see English settlements, French settlements, Dutch, Danish. At this point in time, before 1750s, late 1750s, and moving onwards, at this point in time, it is far from settled, so to speak, which European power will prevail. And at this point in time, these are not colonies. These are European settlements. The Europeans have come there, they've come there to trade. They have to seek the permission of the Mughal emperor, who's the ruling power. Again, very complicated story, because the Mughal Empire was itself on the verge of decline, in some sense of the term, beginning in the early 1700s, after the death of a man called Aurangzeb. Right? So now, and this is what I meant when I said I'm going to show you some slides which are going to give you a capsule history. You just want to listen to it. You're not going to be tested on this, because this is not really part of the reading, and this is more an accumulation of facts. The first and foremost thing that is really astonishing is understanding how a group of people who came to India as traders, representing a company called the East India Company, which was chartered on 31st December 1600 by Queen Elizabeth. Right? She gives a charter. And when she gives a charter, the company is set up, and then eventually, over the course of the next few years, they're going to start sending a few ships there. So what is the astonishing thing that we have to understand is how a group of people who came as traders 150 years later ended up as rulers, right? And officially, India was governed by a trading company, not by England. And again, this is only the official part of the story, because if we were to look at this in much greater detail, we would begin to understand that beginning in the late 1700s, when portions of India begin to fall under British rule, namely under the rule of the East India Company, which is a trading company, right? The East India Company in some ways can be viewed as the beginnings of the modern corporation, right? When you think of the modern corporation, you have to think of, GE, Walmart, General Motors, Ford. Now, of course, we have a different kind of corporation, because it's, they're valued at $500 billion or $1 trillion, and we don't know actually what they do, really. Something like Facebook, there's no product really that you can think of, right? It's a form of mystification, this kind of modern corporation, if I may put it this way, right? But the traditional corporation was this huge, gigantic thing, such as Walmart or General Motors or General Electric or Siemens in Germany, so forth and so on. And of course, the Japanese corporations. The East India Company is really the beginning of the modern corporation. And India is going to be governed by the corporation, but increasingly, the English Parliament is going to exercise control over the company. It's going to suggest, because its concern is that when a company is ruling another country as large as India, ruling a small Central American republic is one thing, which the United Fruit Corporation did. If you know the history of Central America, and you're going to get little segments of it, that large number of these countries were basically ruled by an American corporation, effectively. But ruling a country as large as India, the concern was that the company becomes a state within a state. That it's going to be able, that it becomes so large and so unregulated, it can effectively become another state. And so therefore the idea was that you had to contain the power of the company and even though India was being ruled by a company, increasingly we find, moving into the late 1700s, that Parliament is going to begin to exercise some regulation over the company, right? So it's a complicated set of affairs between the company and Parliament. But we're beginning this narrative in 1700. The East India Company, which is now operating in India, also begins to commence trade with China, and it's importing silk, tea, porcelain. One of the interesting things about the trade, and here it is no exaggeration, you might think it's an exaggeration, but the British, the English, want a great many things from India, right? Textiles, silk, cotton, spices. What do the Indians want from the English? The answer is nothing. I'm serious, absolutely nothing. But you could, one of the things the English sent were woolens. If you know if you know India and you know its geography, well, you know, large parts of India, you don't need woolens at all, by the way. You need them in a few places. And so what did they pay them back with? With bullion. Bullion, silver, gold. That's all they could give, right? And when we get to the Opium Wars, we're going to see how this triangular relationship is going to develop. Right, so in 1707, you have the death of the Mughal emperor. The company has now been around for about, in India, for a little less than 100 years. Its presence is confined largely to the coastal regions, if you remember the maps I showed you before, right? And in fact, actually, the company begins to try to intervene in Indian affairs. So they have a little war with the forces of the Mughal emperor. They get crushed by the Mughal emperor. And in a fit of generosity, which I'm sure generations later was regretted by everyone, in a fit of generosity, he decides to pardon the English, you know, and they continue to trade in India, and gradually they're going to build on. Now, the fundamental argument that has been given about how the company was able to make inroads into India, or to use my earlier language, how they got transformed from being traders to rulers, the fundamental argument is that the Mughal Empire, for a number of reasons, began to decline. And you've all heard that English proverb or aphorism, nature abhors a vacuum, right? That's the old argument, which I'm not going to attempt to contest at this point in time, because then we would have to really get into the complexities of Indian history. But what is very clear is that the British, the French, and now you have to recall that what an argument I made earlier, namely that there is a contest for supremacy, as it was in North America, between the British and the French. And this contest is being fought in other parts of the world. India is one of the big terrains for that. Right? So the French, the British, they're all going to attempt to intervene. They're going to have Indian allies. And in a nutshell, what's going to happen is in 1757, you're going to have this battle. It's called the Battle of Plassey. And at that battle, the forces of the East India Company are going to defeat the forces of one of the Indian rulers in Bengal, right? Who is not the Mughal emperor. The Mughal emperor is the great Mughal emperor sitting in Delhi, but remember that argument is that the Mughal emperor, his power has now declined. And one of the reasons his power had declined, I mean, and this part of the argument is not incorrect at all, is that when you are supervising, as it were, an empire that large, it's very hard to be able to control all the subsidiary rulers who are paying obeisance to you. If someone is sitting 1,500 miles away and says to the Mughal emperor, well, you know, I'm not going to send you any tribute. See what you can do. Well, what is the Mughal emperor going to do necessarily, right? So in other words, you had these people who were breaking away, right? And that's the ruler of Bengal, called the Nawab of Bengal, was one of these rulers who basically is more or less working autonomously, right? And his forces are going to be defeated by the forces of the East India Company. And then if you look at this, you're going to find that there are going to be a number of machinations here, a number of battles. Long and short of it is that you're going to have the British consolidate the rule within 15, 20 years. Once again, still confined largely to the coastal region and now moving a little bit inland as well. All right. In 1769, Battle of Plassey is 57, 1769, you have what is called the Bengal Famine. This famine lasts for 2 years. It kills 10 million people. 10 million people. Bengal famine and this is a very good illustration. I was talking about famines earlier. A very good illustration of a famine that is undoubtedly caused by political and social circumstances. Because one of the things that happened was that with the coming of the British and what you might call the upsetting of the traditional political and social order, it creates a certain kind of anomie. By anomie, I mean it creates a certain kind of anarchy and restlessness. Right? So essentially you have the disappearance of what you might describe as the traditional forces that would have exercised some kind of control and rhythm in that society, and people began to become vulnerable. And then of course there are questions of whether the British had policies that aggravated these famines, as was the case in Ireland in the mid-19th century. And in fact, one could argue that British rule in India is actually characterized, bookended by famines. It begins with this huge famine, and then in 1943, 4 years before Indian independence, you have another famine in Bengal, which kills 3 million people. Right? So when we do this kind of assessment of, because there's some historians who still like to argue that colonial rule was beneficial to these people. If you really look at the British record just with respect to famines, it's absolutely appalling. All right? However, what I am particularly interested in is something different. Before we get to that, this again, simply these slides will be shared with you just so that you have some sense of what are the ramifications of this growing British rule and expansion in India. Because when we speak about colonialism and we speak about the manner in which British rule expanded, and mind you, once again, the same arguments could be made apropos of French expansion in Indochina or Algeria, right? Or other colonies in Africa, all right? There'll be some differences, obviously. But what we're saying is that it has various aspects. There's a military aspect. There's a constant quest for new territories in India. So you're going to have wars of expansion. Then when you have these wars of expansion, you have to ask, how are these wars of expansion being funded? Right? How are they being funded? This is where we're going to find the opium trade has an important part to play, for example. But they may be funded by numerous other ways, measures of taxation, for example. Right? The intellectual aspect of it I'm going to turn to in just a moment, so leave that aside. Then you have an administrative aspect to colonialism. They introduce a new system of governance, a new way of regulating India. So you, for example, carving up India into different districts, right? And then putting them under the rule of various people who are eventually going to become part of what is called the Indian Civil Service. Right? So the Indian Civil Service was basically created by the British in India, and the idea was that you would appoint these people. Sometimes the people who were appointed were very young Britishers who had just come out to India. I mean, they were in the early 20s, mid-20s, and suddenly you might find yourself basically the chief administrative officer of a district with a population of 1 million people, and you don't know the language. I think of all of these scenarios. Right? But this is what I mean by the administrative aspect. All right? And as I've already suggested to you, increasing attempts by the company, right? by parliament to regulate the affairs of the company, to ensure that the company does not become a state within a state. Right? Then there are legal aspects, because of course one of the fundamental arguments of any colonial power in a situation of this kind is that, look, we are going to bring civilization to you. We're going to bring a regime of law and order. Law and order. Because there is no greater claim that a power has to rule a people than to say that, look, under our rule, you are secure. Under the rule of your own people, you were never secure, because that rule was despotic. And you know what despotism means? That there is no guarantee of life or limb or property. That everything is subject to the whim of the despot. And that, by the way, the narrative of the despot still stands true in 2019. I mean, the whole argument about Saddam Hussein was what? He's despotic. right? He's despotic. The whole argument about the president of Syria today, he's despotic, right? That no one is secure in this country because Assad can decide what he wants to do. What we are going to introduce is a regime of law and order, where there is a system of accountability, for example. Right? That's what I mean by the legal aspect of colonialism. Then the social aspect, that we're going to improve these people because they have certain barbarous practices. Right? The natives mistreat their women. The same argument, again, by the way, that I have heard ad nauseum for the last 20 years about why American troops need to be in Afghanistan, because the Afghans, they mistreat their women. You know? So forth and so on. And again, our endeavor here is not to examine each proposition, because yes, we could say they do, but then of course we could ask, well, what's the status of women in US or Western Europe or wherever else, right? The economic aspect, which of course I've already been hinting at throughout, spoken to you some aspects of it. We're going to look at some of this a little bit more closely as we move along in our understanding of colonialism in India. And so what I'm suggesting to you is that the transformation of India under colonial rule is a case study of a very comprehensive socioeconomic transformation that took place. Land relations, let me give you one example there before I move on to the intellectual aspect of it, with which I'm going to close today. Right? So what is called the permanent settlement, the last element on the slide over there, of 1793. So in Bengal, the British had established their ascendancy in 1757. Remember the Battle of Plassey, 1757. Now, so 1793, this is 30, 35 years later. The British basically were trying to assess how they could collect revenues. Remember that if you have a colonial power, what is the economic foundation of that? You need revenues, right? The major form of revenue today is taxation. Right? Now, in 1793 in India, you don't have any individual income tax. In fact, even today, you'll be astonished to learn that less than 5% of the population of India actually pays individual income tax. You know, all right? And I'm not talking about all the millions who are evading taxes, but even if you weren't evading taxes, the total tax base is actually quite small. So the main source of revenue is land taxation. Now the question was, how do you establish what the revenue should be? There, the British view was that because India is a despotic system, a despotic state, that people don't work to improve their land. Right? If you're a farmer, you're not going to spend all this money improving your land. Why? Because the next day, after you've finished improving the land, and when I say improving the land, I mean using improved methods of agriculture, all right, making the land more fertile, having more irrigation, etc., etc. The British view was, you finish your improvements, next day the despot comes and appropriates the land. That's a British view. So they said, what we want to do is we want to create a system whereby there is an incentive for a person to improve the land, and of course they're going to alter land relations completely, so they introduce what's called a permanent settlement. So they say that, let's say you have 10 acres of land, I'm the landlord, and they're going to say to me in 1793, under the permanent settlement, that I'm going to pay 5,000 rupees. I'm taking a random sum of money. I'm using the Indian currency. 5,000 rupees is going to be what I'm going to be paying to the state every year. All right, I improve the land, and my crop grows threefold. Next year, I'm still going to pay only 5,000, even though the land is 3 times as fertile now, or 10 times, or 20 times. However, of course, it could well be the case that there could be a drought for the next 5 years. Then that's the flip side of it, right? Then I still have to pay the same amount, because the permanent settlement meant a settlement in perpetuity. In perpetuity. And what they were trying to do really however, was they were trying to create a class of landowners similar to the class of landowners that they had in England itself. All right? So this is an illustration of what I'm referring to as a massive transformation that takes place in India. All right? But let me conclude this segment for today with the following observation very quickly. Namely, that you can look at the economic aspect of colonization, the political aspect, the military aspect. In some ways, the most enduring aspect, what really survives, is the intellectual conquest. What the British really sought to do was to transform the way in which Indians would think about the world. And of course, partly with the objective of making them compliant with colonial rule, right? And they set out to study Indian languages, create grammars and dictionaries of all the Indian languages, write histories, understand the flora, the fauna. This just shows you little portions. If you look at this slide, just look at the works here, and these slides will be made available to you. Because you have to ask, why are they writing all these histories? And of course, I know that the intellectual here today will say, the reason why the Europeans are doing it is because they're full of intellectual curiosity, right? This is what defines Europe. We have a curiosity about the whole world. You know, the Arabs don't have any curiosity about us. The Indians don't have any curiosity. But we Europeans, we have a curiosity about the rest of the world. No, it wasn't just curiosity. If you're going to conquer a people and rule them, you have to know them. And this is what they were doing. And if you look at this slide here, continuation, and this slide, a continuation. And I could add 20 slides, 50 of all the works that they produced. This was what I'm calling the intellectual conquest of India, which was one of the most extraordinary aspects of colonization. All right, we stop here and we pick up the narrative on Friday.